Historicism started in the late 1700s with German writers like Herder, then continued through 1800s with historians like von Ranke and Meinke, and into the 1900s with thinkers like Dilthey, Collingwood, Gadamer, Cassirer, and Mannheim. Hegel and Marx also played big roles in shaping historicist ideas, as did literary historians like Saint Beuve and Taine, who emphasized the importance of considering the historical context when studying literature. The new historicism, despite its name, often revisits older ideas rather than introducing entirely new ones. Historicism is about looking at everything in its historical context. This means that when we study things like thoughts, art, or literature, we cannot ignore the time and place they come from. For example, Shakespeare's work reflects the beliefs and values of his time, which are different from those of Plato. So we have to understand them differently. Another aspect of historicism is the idea that history follows certain patterns or rules which can help us predict and explain things. This idea is especially clear in the writings of Hegel and Marx. There is also the challenge of understanding cultures from different times. How can we really know what life was like in the past, and how can we avoid letting our own biases influence our interpretation? Scholars like Dilthey, Gadamer, and Hirsch have different ways of tackling this problem. Hirsch believes in separating what the author meant from how we interpret it, while Gadamer suggests that we should recognize that texts are shaped by the interpretations that came before us and that our own perspective is influenced by the past too. By acknowledging these limitations, we can better understand and appreciate the cultures of the past. The debate over historical interpretation often leads to two main viewpoints: solely on the aesthetic qualities of a text and ignores its historical context, and another that sees texts as products of their culture and time, paying less attention to what the author intended. These views clash with the principles of historicism, which emphasize understanding texts within their historical settings. 20th century movements like Russian formalism and New Criticism tend to lean towards formalism, disregarding historical context. Structuralism also tends to be ahistorical, focusing on the structure of language and literature at a particular moment rather than considering historical change. However, structuralism differs from strict formalism by placing texts within broader systems of meaning. Some adaptations of structuralism, like the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, do consider the historical dimension of language as an ideological force. Elements of historicism also influence hermeneutics and reader response theory, which explore how different historical periods interpret texts differently. Scholars like Schleiermacher, who is considered the founder of hermeneutics, have influenced both historicists like Dilthey and Gadamer and reception theorists like Hans Robert Jauss. The new historicism, emerging in the 1980s, opposed two main ideas: the belief that literary texts exist independently from their context, and the Marxist idea that texts are mainly shaped by economic factors. New historicism saw literary texts as part of a complex network of cultural discourses, religious, political, economic, and aesthetic, that both influenced them and were influenced by them. What made the new historicism different was its insistence, inspired by Foucault and post-structuralism, that history itself is a form of interpretation and there is no single fixed version of it. It rejected the idea of historical progress and moved away from studying literary genres and figures. In this approach, culture was seen as a construct made up of various conflicting and competing and interests. Unlike traditional views which tied everything back to economics, the new historicism looked at power dynamics in a broader sense, seeing them as dispersed and operating in different ways without clear connections to specific entities. In this approach, culture was seen as a construct made up of various conflicting and competing forces and interests. Unlike traditional views, which tied everything back to economics, the new historicism looked at power dynamics in a broader sense, seeing them as dispersed and operating in different ways without clear connections to specific entities. Literature was considered just one part of a larger cultural conversation, and the new historicism insisted on understanding this whole complex without making sweeping generalizations or taking firm political stances. While criticized for being politically passive and accepting Foucault's abstract idea of power too readily, this approach has still had a significant impact, encouraging academics to consider the broader cultural context in which literature is created and understood. Many scholars within this approach also see literature as actively participating in power struggles between different social and political authorities. The term New Historicism was coined by Stephen Greenblatt in 1982 in an introduction to a journal issue focusing on the Renaissance. Greenblatt and subsequent critics associated with this approach rejected the idea that it was a fixed theory or doctrine. Instead, they highlighted certain key concerns and methods, such as rejecting the idea of aesthetic autonomy and placing literature within a broader cultural context. Louis Montrose emphasized the importance of re-evaluating how authors fit into their linguistic systems within this contextualization. He also noted that new historicists recognize literature's ability to challenge social and political authority. This subversive potential has been explored by critics, particularly in Britain, where they have adopted Raymond Williams's term cultural materialists, especially concerning Renaissance literature. Greenblatt and others, like Jonathan Dollimore, have re-evaluated Shakespeare's work, challenging traditional interpretations and emphasizing its political dimensions. Dollimore's radical tragedy questioned orthodoxies about Shakespearean literature, and political Shakespeare challenged the idea of Shakespeare as a timeless genius, highlighting his work's political implications. Similarly, alternative Shakespeares brought together writers who challenged traditional character analysis and emphasized broader structural and ideological issues in Shakespeare's texts, drawing from various theories like psychoanalysis, Marxism, and feminism. These studies not only revised our understanding of the Renaissance but also demonstrated how Renaissance issues have implications for broader theoretical discussions. They showed that the complexity of Renaissance cultural processes undermines attempts to see any period's culture as homogeneous. Other critics, such as Jerome McGinn, extended new historical concerns to other periods like Romanticism. The principles of new historicism can be observed in the work of Michel Foucault, who has been a significant influence on this critical